Choosing the harder right over the easier wrong is a challenge that every generation faces, and it's certainly one that the American founding generation faced. And what I'd like to do today is to assess just how well it faced some of its challenges, and also to contextualize some of its challenges. It's easy enough for us, from the perspective of 2006, to look back at people in 1776 or 1801 and spurn them for the way that they lived and the world that surrounded them. And I am full of confidence that 200 or 250 years from now, people will look back on us and think that some of the things that we do and some of the things that we tolerate and some of the things that we don't tolerate, right, are reason for us to be scorned. So I think it's appropriate to approach this subject with a critical eye as well as a modest one, thinking not only about where they succeeded and where they failed, but also about how perhaps we're succeeding and we're failing. And so with that, I want to begin by just refreshing your memory about some of the things that the founders actually stood for. In my lecture 2 days ago, I spoke about the American founding in theory, right? The ideas behind the American Revolution, more broadly, or more narrowly, the War for Independence. And some of the principles that we discussed were Lockean liberalism, right? The idea that all human beings, everyone, has natural rights, and that the only legitimate purpose of government is to protect those rights, namely the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property, or as Jefferson phrased it, the right to pursue happiness. So that was the goal of the American government. And we spoke also a little bit about classical republicanism, this belief that if the government is going to succeed in achieving its goals, it has to structure itself, and society should be structured in a way so that people are virtuous. And by virtue, of course, the founding generation meant independent, self-reliant, or, as I would say, disinterested. That they were people who could engage the public, not for selfish gain, but rather, when they were involved with government, they were involved with government because they wanted to do things for the good of all, right? Government was not supposed to be the feeding frenzy of hogs, around a bucket of corn, right? Government was instead supposed to be an enterprise where at the times when people did have to come together, when they could only come together to achieve the ends of government, they would come together in a way that was fair and just for all. Right? So those were their ultimate goals. Those were their ultimate desires. Those were their basic principles. In the Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson said that all people are entitled to self-government and that we should be self-governing, I think it was clear in his mind that the statement had a double meaning. It wasn't just that the 13 colonies should be able to govern themselves, but that all of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies should be able to govern themselves. And yet we all know, and they all knew, that that statement was replete with contradictions and apparent hypocrisies, right? Because one of the most obvious challenges for the founding generation, these people who said that first and foremost, the purpose of government was to ensure individual liberty, was the fact that everywhere they looked, they were surrounded by the institution of slavery. I mentioned yesterday that at the time Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he owned 200 other human beings. Over the course of his life, he owned 600 slaves in total. George Washington, right, the father of the country that is the United States, was the largest slaveholder in all of Virginia. So slavery was a big part of the lives of these men, and indeed it was a big part of the lives of people throughout what would become the United States. A lot of times Americans today think of slavery as a particularly Southern institution. But really at the time of the American Revolution, that was not the case. There was slavery everywhere. There were slaves in the South, to be sure, and in the South, because there was plantation agriculture, slavery was most popular. and slaves were most populous. But even in the North, there was slavery. In 1776, every single state that declared itself independent allowed slavery under its laws. Even in Connecticut, all right, a place that you don't think of as a hotbed of slavery, the last slave to die in Connecticut passed away in 1833, all right, just a few short decades before the Declaration of Independence of the Southern States, which tipped off the Civil War. And so slavery was something that was throughout America. It was a problem for all Americans. And a lot of times people today will try to let the founders off easily by saying, well, they didn't know any better. We shouldn't try to impose upon them our principles. We know that slavery is wrong, but they didn't know that slavery was wrong. But that's wrong. I mean, that's just factually incorrect. Because they did know that slavery was wrong. Certainly the leadership understood the wrongness of slavery. All right, Thomas Jefferson, for example, said that, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. In other words, for America, slavery was not some sort of blessing. Slavery was a curse. And how to extricate ourselves from that curse, how to exercise that curse, was a problem that the revolutionary generation tackled and ultimately had to pass along to generations that would follow. Why was it so difficult for them to rid themselves of slavery? I mean, to us, it seems so simple and so clear. And in many respects, it is so simple and so clear. Slavery is wrong, and you cannot tolerate such horrible abuses of human life. But I think as all of us can understand and appreciate, human beings have weaknesses. Human beings oftentimes won't take the tougher choice to do the right thing. Jefferson described slavery as like holding the wolf by the ears. Right? Imagine this. Right? If you're holding a wolf by its ears, you're kind of screwed, aren't you? You know? Right? With slavery, we're holding the wolf by the ears, and we can neither safely hold it nor safely let it go. I mean, the thing's just getting angrier and angrier. Yet, if you let it go, there's a wolf in your face. Slavery to the founding generation was in many respects like a wolf because it was so difficult for them to imagine doing without it. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that in 1776, it was just so vital to the economy. And sadly, in decades to follow, especially after the 1793 invention by Eli Whitney of the cotton gin, slavery would get even more vital. Slavery was the fuel of our economy. After the cotton gin especially, America's chief export was cotton. We were the source of 75% of the world's cotton supply. Cotton was the source of 60% of our GDP. Cotton was to America as oil is, say, to Saudi Arabia. And of course, slaves were used to produce rice and tobacco and wheat and sugar and so many other crops on which Americans relied. And yet, it was clear to the founding generation that while slavery might bring wealth, it was, at the very least, culturally debilitating. It was debilitating not just for white people who relied upon slaves, but it was debilitating also for black people who were forced into slavery. For white people, they thought that slavery was really almost one of the worst things that could happen. Now, obviously, it's worse for black people, and we'll get to them. But imagine this. Imagine being, you can't imagine this. I hope you can't imagine this. But at least try. Imagine owning someone else. Imagine being a slaveholder. Imagine what that would do to you. Imagine the habits of the mind that would breed. Imagine how being raised as a child in that sort of environment that would affect your ability to relate to those around you. As Jefferson wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia, oftentimes on plantations, a child would see their parent storming. The child would look on. Slaves would be abused. Slaves would be ordered around. And thus would begin a habit that was particularly contradictory with the principles of republicanism. All right? If the meaning of America was that all people were going to be equal under the law, that everyone was going to be in charge of his or her own life, that all people were going to be self-governing, can you imagine the habits of the mind that would be bred into a child growing up on a slave plantation? How fit could that person possibly be for a free government? That was a serious, serious worry. Something had to be done about it. And yet, of course, there was the problem of the government itself, the Union itself. In 1776, when Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, he included in the Declaration a provision blaming the slave trade on the British government. Perhaps just to lay a seed, right? To put America on record from the date of its birth, that slavery was wrong. And yet, the representatives of South Carolina and Georgia said, if this thing isn't taken out, we're taking ourselves out. We are not going to join into the American Revolution. The Continental Congress caved. The provision blaming the slave trade on the king was removed. So throughout America's founding years, thinking about doing away with slavery was coupled with the question of could you do this without doing away with the United States of America itself? How could you find a compromise? And could you compromise? The founding generation tried a number of different tactics to try to get rid of slavery. Among them were things such as gradual emancipation. When the ship Amistad, right, landed in Connecticut in 1839, finally there, slavery had been eradicated. That was the case in most of the northern states. Right, the first state to ban slavery was actually not one of the first 13 states. It was our 14th state. It was Vermont when it joined the United States. Soon after the American Revolution, however, people certainly understanding that slavery was in contradiction with the principles for which they had fought, people in the northern states, states that weren't so heavily reliant upon slavery, began to pursue bills of gradual emancipation. In New York, for example, starting on July 4th, a significant date, 1799, all slaves would be freed when they turned 23 if they were a woman, and 28 if they were a man. Interesting, those dates. Obviously, there's some self-serving going on there, right? You know, we want to have people working for us during their most fit and sturdy years. Then we'll free them. And of course, slavery was eventually, through this process, eradicated in New York. But sadly, not all of New York's slaves would be freed. You can imagine if you were a farmer in New York or a merchant or someone who owned slaves, and you were told that on a certain date this slave would be free, what might you do? Especially if it's after 1793. Especially if cotton is booming in the South, especially if in the South there's a great demand for slave labor, especially if in the South the value of slaves is skyrocketing. If you own slaves in New York, what would you do? Well, I hope you wouldn't do what so many people in New York did. So many people in New York sold their slaves south. 2/3 of the slaves of New York were sold by their owners to southern slaveholders. So gradual emancipation, in some ways, solved the problem for some of the states, but in some ways it created problems of its own. Slavery, once a national institution, now became the South's peculiar institution. Slavery became a form of labor on which the South relied now more than ever. And of course, you could see that gradual emancipation helps to set the stage for the American Civil War. The founders pursued other tactics to try to limit slavery. They all had their pluses, and they also had some minuses. Right? Jefferson stood on both sides of the question of territorial limitation or diffusion. What I mean by that is this. In 1784, Thomas Jefferson, as a member of Congress, proposed a bill that would have outlawed slavery in all of the unorganized federal territory south of the Great Lakes, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. All right? All the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, east of the Mississippi River, all that land would be free from slavery. Congress considered the bill. It came up for a vote. There was one guy from New Jersey who was in favor of this bill, but was deathly ill and was therefore absent. And by one vote, this bill failed to pass. And Jefferson wrote that heaven was silent in that awful moment. I mean, you can imagine how that would have rewritten, perhaps, the pages of American history if there hadn't been slavery in Alabama or Mississippi or Tennessee or Kentucky. And yet, the issue of territorial limitation also had problems of its own. As we just pointed out, with the transfer of slaves and slavery from the north to the south, the concentration of slavery in one area could make it all the more difficult for that area to try to extricate itself from slavery as it got more and more reliant upon it. And of course, more and more American people began to demand that slavery be allowed throughout American territory. They saw it, of course, as an issue of property rights, really very much as it was seen, or at least as the argument was made last night when we watched the case of the Amistad. You own a car, you could drive it from one state to another, or in their context, a horse and a buggy. Why couldn't they bring their human property from one state to another? Right? That was their argument. That was what they believed would help make the eradication of slavery eventually possible. Because if slavery was concentrated, to do away with it would be absolutely debilitating. To give it up if they were less reliant upon it, they hoped might be more possible. Certainly one way to reduce the number of slaves in America was to do away with the importation of slaves into America. And that is probably one of the most successful things that the founding generation pursued. At the time of the ratification of the Constitution, or debate over what the Constitution would say, at the Constitutional Convention, they agreed upon a compromise. The slave trade, the importation of slaves from Africa, would not immediately be banned. But it could be discussed and proposed and enacted after a period of 20 years. And so when those 20 years had elapsed, when Jefferson was president in 1808, the federal government finally banned the further importation of slaves from Africa. So from that point on, slavery in America would come about as a result of perhaps natural population increase. But people would not legally be captured in Africa and brought to American shores. Right? That would be against the law. And it's interesting to think about why this particular measure was politically practicable while others, in many cases, were not. And the simple fact of the matter, I think, is that it appealed to the interests of the people who were in power. Certainly the people in the North, who were more and more fervent in their call for emancipation, were happy to see an end to the slave trade. But certainly, so were Southern plantation owners, especially the rich, especially the powerful, especially those who already had big plantations, especially those who already had large numbers of slaves, because these individuals would now have slaves who were worth even more, right? Because the supply of slaves was going to be limited. So it was kind of a peculiar and unsavory alliance between people who were authentically opposed to slavery and those who merely wanted to increase the value of their property. But it was one of the few instances where something practicable was done to try to extricate Americans from the issue of slavery. So is this inspiring? Is this something that we should pin a medal on the chest of the founding generation for? Are their accomplishments really that great? It's really difficult to say that they are, especially when you consider that it wasn't their generation that finally did away with slavery in America. But I think it's also very difficult to cast much blame upon them when you think about what doing away with slavery ultimately did to America. Again, we have individuals who believe in principles, such as liberty. And yet, it's not always a case that principles are coming into conflict with selfish interests. It's oftentimes the case that principles are coming into conflict with other principles. We believe in liberty, and we believe that this is the best government in the world to secure that for us. And yet, if we strike out against this offense against liberty, we may strike dead that very government. That, essentially, was their dilemma. If we think about some of the other issues in which the founders had to wrestle with principles that came into conflict, one that is at first glance perhaps difficult for us to understand was their proclamation of political equality, and yet their very unequal treatment of women and landless men when it came time for voting. Now, I should point out that this is, in the federal system that is, and even more to it, truly was the United States, voting qualifications were not a matter for federal policy. They were state issues. Each state would determine who got to vote. And yet, in nearly all the states, at the start of America's existence, you could not vote if you were a man who did not own a sufficient amount of property. And in all states, except one, very briefly, New Jersey in the 1780s, you could not vote if you were a woman. In New Jersey, women for a brief while were allowed to vote if A, they were single, and B, they owned as much property as men in New Jersey who were allowed to vote. And that kind of helps us to understand why they decided to limit the franchise in the way that they did. The idea of republicanism, the idea that we want a group of people coming together and using the government not to further their own selfish interests, but only to do things that are for the good of all, was based on the assumption that that was possible when you had people participating in government, and really only people participating in government who were self-reliant, who were independent. All right, this is why Jefferson said that farmers were the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people. A farmer could take care of himself. A farmer could provide for his own basic needs. And most important of all, a farmer didn't have a boss except himself. This wasn't a nation of people who were used to kowtowing to authority. This wasn't a nation of people who were used to great enforced hierarchies. This wasn't a nation of people who were like the people I'm surrounded by at West Point. And at West Point, I've become people who are always saying, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, right? This was not a place where there was a great deal of official rank. This was a place where people were in charge of themselves. And yet, so it was really, really frightening for a lot of members of the founding generation to imagine that anyone could be participating in government if they didn't fully own themselves, if they weren't fully in charge of themselves, if they weren't fully self-reliant, if they weren't fully independent. The word virtue, as we said yesterday, right, the Latin root for that is man. And when they said virtue, what they meant was independence, self-reliance. You can imagine in their economy how they, in their farming economy, how they saw men as being the people who were the economic engines. Men as the people who were the heads of the households. Men as the people who were only capable of taking care of themselves. A woman without a husband was a woman in their world with a father. Women were always seen as being dependent upon others. Only in rare cases were women single and property owners. And frankly, in many of those cases, especially if you go back to the 1600s, those women were really scorned, were really misunderstood. There was a book that came out a few years ago about the Salem witchcraft trials. And one of the things that it pointed out was that a disproportionately high number of the people who were accused of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts, were single women who owned property. This was anathema, right, to their idea of the way the world worked, right? And men who didn't own property. These people, in their eyes, almost weren't real men. Right? That is why these restrictions were in place. But let me tell you about the founding generation in particular and how it took part in changing these restrictions. At the time of Thomas Jefferson's birth, no state allowed landless men to vote. No colony, I should say. At the time of Thomas Jefferson's death, nearly every state allowed all men, all white men, to vote. And one of the reasons for this was because of a change in our economy, because the market started to transform the way Americans lived. A nation that was once 98% farmers. Soon during the market revolution, I'm going to talk more about this fantastic economic development on Thursday. Soon there were options. Soon there were other ways to generate wealth. Soon there were other career paths to pursue. Soon there were a lot of people who were smart and responsible and successful and independent who didn't own land because they lived in cities. Right? And they were bankers or investors or inventors. And so as time passed, people became more and more comfortable with the idea of expanding the franchise, of recognizing that perhaps it's not just that all people should be equal under the law, but that perhaps all people could be equal over the law. And of course, in the case of women's call for suffrage, of women's call for equal rights, it was to the very ideas of the American Revolution that women turned. You all perhaps have availed yourself of the opportunity to take a look at the exchange that's included in your binder between John Adams and Abigail Adams. That series of letters in which Abigail writes to John Adams. He's in Philadelphia. It's 1776. He's there on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. They're writing these laws for this new nation. They're throwing off the yoke of British tyranny. And Abigail writes to her husband and she says, John, remember the ladies. Remember that it's not just the men of America who are the victims of tyranny. It's not just the men of America who are oppressed. And John Adams, pretty enlightened guy, but even John Adams, he didn't really know how to take this. I mean, you look at their exchange, and it's serious on the one hand and playful on the other. Sort of like John Adams, he said, "You're joking. If we gave power to the women, what would come next after that? We're going to give black people the right to vote? Indians? College students?" He thought this was absurd. And yet it was those principles of the Declaration, those universal claims about human liberty that inspired Abigail Adams and later the women at Seneca Falls to quote the principles of the American Revolution to advance the cause of women's suffrage. So the American Revolution very much provided seeds for this sort of thing. The American Revolution is oftentimes considered not just the war for American independence, but instead it's thought of as a movement that began before Lexington and Concord in 1775 and continued on beyond the Treaty of Paris of 1783. All right? Some would say that the American Revolution continues even today, as today we still struggle to apply the ideals of 1776. And yet if you focus on the war itself, on the war for independence, you realize that, of course, that war, like all wars, challenged some of the most cherished ideals for which they fought. How do you fight a war about freedom when you're fighting a war, right? We touched on this 2 days ago briefly. But if republicanism is about independent people who can independently decide for themselves to participate in public life, How do you, in the midst of a long and crappy war, rely upon people's disinterestedness, their sense of duty, to go off and sacrifice and die, especially when others are free to stay back at home and live and profit and not sacrifice? For them, this was a really great dilemma. In the early years of the war, there was what one historian has called a rage militaire. All right? Everyone was into it. Right? Everyone wanted to do this whole revolution thing. You know? If you didn't sign up with the militia or the Continental Army, and you were a young man, no women would talk to you. Right? You were absolutely spurned. And yet, as time passed, as the war wore on, more and more people found it more and more difficult to actually make that sort of commitment. The government started to turn to incentives, offering bounties to people who signed up, increasing the pay of people who signed up, appealing to their economic self-interest. And in addition, some states began effectively to conscript people, to impose upon localities quotas, numbers of men who had to be sent forward for the purpose of fighting in the war. And this, of course, resulted, for all practical purposes, in something along the lines of a draft. You know, so some men were sent to fight against their will. And then, of course, you have the scene at Newburgh, New York. Once the fighting war is over, but before the Treaty of Peace has been signed, and the Continental Army, the very army that had seen it through all the way since 1775, through all the hardships, through all the ordeals, this same army which had done so much to try to secure republicanism for the United States, and most especially the principle that we are a self-governing land, not a land that is governed by the people who have the biggest guns. These people, who at the time had the biggest guns, some of them flirted with the idea that maybe they should go down to Philadelphia, try to make George Washington our king. And George Washington, when he heard about this, was absolutely outraged. He wrote to one of the proponents of the plan to make him a monarch that nothing could be more detestable to him. And he called together all of the officers at Newburgh. And he called them together in this meeting house that's set up there and that was later dubbed the Temple of Virtue. And he stood in front of them and he had a speech prepared. But the thing that really hit the men was not his speech, but what he said beforehand. George Washington, of course, had been serving, had volunteered to serve as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army for the entire length of the war. George Washington, the richest man in Virginia, had more to lose than just about anyone else in the war. George Washington served throughout the war and refused to collect pay. So here's this man who's been there through the entire fight. This man who has chanced everything for the gain of absolutely nothing for him personally. George Washington stands there, sort of fumbles with his notes. And then he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out something that none of the officers had ever seen him with, a pair of glasses. And he puts on these glasses and he says, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me, for I've grown not only gray, but also blind in the service to my country." And in that one moment, all the talk, all the griping, all the ideas to somehow subvert what had been fought for, all those plots sort of crumbled into nothing. And according to the people who were there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Right? George Washington's sacrifice reminded those men of what they had really been fighting for. So the lesson is the founding generation did play with fire. They played with war. War is always a great threat to individual liberty and freedom. But there are some wars that are fought to protect individual liberty and freedom. It doesn't make war any less dangerous. It doesn't mean that the outcome is guaranteed. In the case of the United States' war for independence, the outcome was not guaranteed. But ultimately, in this case, the founding generation prevailed and did the right thing. Another thing that the founders fought for was limited government. Right? The idea was not that it was the king's dominion and he could do whatever he wanted to do, and that all of our rights came from him. It was that all of our rights came from God. It was that all of our rights were inherent in our very humanity, and that government didn't give us powers, but that we gave government powers, and only those powers that were necessary, only to do the things that we couldn't do on our own. That government existed principally to protect our rights. And so when you see the founding generation drafting their state constitutions, when you see them drafting the Articles of Confederation, they intentionally created governments that were very, very weak. The fact that they could actually win this war with these governments is in many ways miraculous. Their executives had very little power. The states gave themselves very little power to raise revenue, which gave them very little ability to buy weapons, to pay their soldiers. And the problematic nature of governments that were so limited and so weak is, for better or worse, one of the main reasons that in 1787, people came together in Philadelphia for the purposes of scrapping the Articles of Confederation and creating for America a new constitution. But even this new constitution would be a government that had serious limits. Of course, it would have checks and balances. There would be supermajorities needed to pass laws. Right? There was an amendment process, but that would require supermajorities on the part of the states. And of course, the Constitution, which in many ways was a license to the national government, all right, a license for power, also included a Bill of Rights, a restraining order, which told the government precisely what it could not do. And yet, immediately after the ratification of the Constitution, some of its principal proponents started to debate what it meant. Jefferson, of course, was the author of the Declaration of Independence. Probably the two men who deserve the most credit for the Constitution were James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. All right? They were like the Batman and the Robin, okay, of the Constitutional Convention. And they, of course, with John Jay, were the authors of the Federalist Papers, which helped to convince the people of New York as well as other states that the Constitution should be ratified. All of this collaboration, all of this working together, all of these discussions, Madison and Hamilton thought that they were in complete sync over what the Constitution meant and why it should be enacted. And yet, as soon as it was enacted, with Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, with Madison as a leader in Congress, now with Thomas Jefferson back from his tour of duty as our ambassador to France, serving as Secretary of State under President George Washington, now we have a group of men you would think would all agree and get along, now unable to agree on what the Constitution actually meant. Hamilton proposing that a national bank, for example, be erected under the Constitution. And Madison reminding Hamilton, like, duh, that the idea of a national bank was brought up at the Constitutional Convention and explicitly removed from the text of the Constitution. And yet Hamilton found a way to read into the Constitution an authorization for a national bank. Well, we took it out, but it's still in there between the lines, Hamilton said. And it's this debate over how limited the federal government should be that animated the conflict in the 1790s between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson and Madison's Republicans. And ultimately, the Republicans would triumph. All right? And Jefferson would be elected president in 1800 and again in 1804. And Madison, of course, would be his successor, elected in 1805. 1908. And yet Jefferson and Madison themselves had problems understanding that the government could have limits. And yet here again, it's not just a case of people who aren't faithful to their principles. It's a case of people who live real lives and have to choose between their principles. The case that illustrates this the best, I think, is the case of the Louisiana Purchase. Right? Jefferson had the opportunity to get from the government of France this vast swath of land west of the Mississippi River. It had been occupied by Spain. It had been occupied by France. He feared that if ever it was occupied permanently by a European power, America would not be able to avoid coming into conflict with that power. Britain, remember, still controlled Canada to the north. Imagine Napoleon's France permanently controlling Louisiana to the west. The United States of America would be nothing but a battlefield between the world's two greatest superpowers. How could we possibly avoid being brought into their conflict? And yet, if somehow we could buy Louisiana, if somehow we could obtain this land, Jefferson thought we could avoid the evil of war. We could avoid the dangers of war and all the threats that it poses to our liberties. Because we would not only have this wonderful, wonderful moat called the Atlantic Ocean to our east, but we would also have to our west, all right, this great ocean of land that would separate us from the strife of Europe. So getting Louisiana, Jefferson thought, was absolutely essential to the survival of the United States and more important, to the survival of liberty in the United States. And Jefferson thought, too, that so long as you had Louisiana, you could have a nation that was both growing and able to remain a nation of independent-minded farmers, right? It would provide us, as Jefferson said, land for 100 generations. And that was pretty necessary in a nation where, in some parts of the country, as we've said, the average woman had 8 children during her lifetime. The population of the United States was doubling every 22 years. Where could we live and how could we live like independent people, not all pressed together, not living under the authority of others, with breathing room and freedom if we didn't somehow acquire this land for us to spread and grow? We spoke 2 days ago about the idea that history moves in cycles and that all the great civilizations of the past had progressed through these cycles from the state of nature to the agrarian phase, and gosh, that was a great phase because people were hardworking and self-reliant and independent, and they were good neighbors, but they took care of themselves. And that success bred the success of empire, and yet that brought luxury and decadence and corruption and vice. And finally, society would collapse under its own corpulence, and you'd have the decline and the fall and the return to the state of nature. Jefferson believed that if we could get Louisiana, rather than progressing through time, we could sort of freeze ourselves in time by moving across space, by moving to the west, by acquiring all this land so that we could remain in the agrarian phase. And yet there was a problem with this opportunity to purchase Louisiana. A pretty serious problem. The Constitution didn't say that you could add on territory. It said nothing about adding on territory. If you think of the Constitution as a union between the North and the South, well, let me put it to you this way. About 4 years ago, I got married. I love my wife. We have a little baby now, 9 months old. All right? Everything's going great. And even if there was a little hiccup in our marriage, I could accept that. But here's something that would be difficult for me to accept. 4 years ago, we get married. Let's say that 4 days from now, I go home. And I see my wife, Christine, standing at the door. And she says, "Hi, honey. Welcome home. Meet Julio." Right? Because the North and the South were married under the Constitution. And by adding the West, by adding the Louisiana Purchase territory, you fundamentally change that union. You fundamentally change that marriage. It goes from being this couple, the North and the South, to this strange, weird menage a trois, right? How do you not recognize that that fundamentally alters the deal that the North and the South thought they were getting into? For the North especially, this commercially engaged, eastward, European-oriented land of commerce. Look west at Kansas. Is Kansas going to be a place where cod fishing is big? Right? Is Kansas going to be a place that shares the interests of Massachusetts? Or is it going to be a place that's more like Virginia? In other words, by adding Louisiana, it was pretty clear that the federal union was fundamentally changed, and that the bargain that the people of the North signed on to was fundamentally altered, and fundamentally probably to their detriment. And Jefferson understood this, and he wanted to be faithful to the Constitution. He knew that he wasn't authorized to do this, and he said to James Madison, his Secretary of State, his chief advisor, his boy wonder, right? He said to James Madison, well, I've got it. It's obvious. Let's do a constitutional amendment, right? Let's officially write in that we could purchase the Louisiana territory. If we could get a majority of the states, 3/4, to ratify this, then it's okay, then it's constitutional. Madison said, Jefferson was in some ways the man who was more into principles. Madison was perhaps the more principled pragmatist. Madison said, don't be an idiot, Tom. Because if you do that, the opportunity to get this land which we know is so vital to our future, might slip through our fingers. If we delay, we run the risk of France pulling out of the deal. If we delay, we run the risk that perhaps this constitutional amendment won't pass. Just do it. And ultimately, Jefferson did. But again, it wasn't because the Constitution and an honest interpretation of the Constitution didn't matter to him. It's that other principles, such as the survival and the perpetuation of liberty in the United States and its ability in the future to avoid war, mattered even more. Finally, we have another instance in which the principles of the American founding seem to come into conflict with its practices. And this is the instance of the embargo. During Jefferson's presidency, as in the years before Jefferson's presidency, it seemed as if conflict between France on the one hand and Britain on the other was a law of physics, right? I mean, it was as certain as gravity that France and England would be fighting with one another. And the United States, of course, as a new and fledgling nation, used that conflict to its advantage as best that it could. During the Revolution, we knew that France was angry about being vanquished from North America by the British and the Americans during the French and Indian War. We knew that France wanted payback, and we were willing to allow them to get that payback against the British by allying themselves with us and helping us to win our independence. So, no problem. We could play those two against one another. But the problem was those two, of course, would like to play us against the other. Once we were a free nation, we were willing and eager to trade with the rest of the world. It's interesting when you think about the founders and what they think about the world around them. I mean, they're profoundly ambivalent, really. They want to be engaged with the rest of the world. They travel abroad, and they're so impressed by the rest of the world and so eager to take in the rest of the world. But when they look at Europe, when they look at the corruption there, when they look at the vice there, when they look at the oppression there, when they look at the stratification there, the fact that there are aristocrats and essentially serfs there, they want to keep America as far away from Europe as possible. But still, there was hardly ever an impulse to shut themselves off from the world, and America's foreign trade increased substantially year after year after year. We traded more with Great Britain in 1786 than we did with Great Britain in 1776. And our trade with France and also the rest of continental Europe was increasing as well. And American sailors were oftentimes out on the high seas. And yet, when Britain and France were warring with one another, they didn't want us. They didn't want individual Americans to be able to buy and sell things with individual British people if they were French, or French people if they were British. And the navies of those two nations would attack and seize the cargoes of our ships and kidnap our sailors and force them oftentimes into service as members of their ships' crews. When they were out on the high seas and we were caught trying to trade with either of these nations, they were forcing us to try to choose between the two. Trade only with Britain and ally ourselves with Britain, or trade only with France and ally ourselves with France. And the American public was outraged. And Jefferson was outraged. Jefferson was also in a dilemma. To ally ourselves with one of these nations was hardly a way to elevate ourselves or reinforce our commitment to republicanism and liberty. To ally ourselves and bring ourselves into the orbit of Great Britain. What a tragedy that would be. So few years after we had successfully and at great cost to life and liberty fought a war to pull ourselves away from Britain. And yet it's not as if liberty and fraternity and equality had been successfully enacted in France. It's not as if that nation was a place for us to pick up great principles in the 1790s. And so Jefferson made a tough choice. To avoid war, to avoid choosing sides, to avoid falling into the orbit of either of these nations, Jefferson passed a law that would avoid them altogether. And in 1807, Congress agreed to enact a universal embargo of all foreign trade. This takes your breath away, folks. This is like unbelievable. All foreign trade was stopped. Right? There might be someone in Britain who has something that you want to buy, and you may have agreed on a price. You may get along fine. You might be cousins, but you can't do that trade. You can't trade with someone in France. And you can't even trade with someone in the Netherlands because the government didn't trust that a boat bound for the Netherlands would really be bound for the Netherlands. It would be like going to the Netherlands and then, whoop, we're in London, right? Or, whoop, we're in France. And so all trade was outlawed. And Jefferson's biggest fear was that the cure might end up being worse even than the disease. And in the case of the embargo, I think it clearly was. Certainly there were some perhaps beneficial effects. Americans became more self-reliant. Obviously, if you don't have legal access to things from Britain or France, the price of those things is going to go up. It allowed American manufacturers the ability to enter into new markets and start making new things, got their feet on the ground, but at great expense to the American consumer, at great expense to American liberty, and very greatly to the detriment of the American government that Jefferson and Madison had helped to establish and wanted so much to safeguard. Because the real tragedy of the embargo was not how it protected Americans from the pernicious influence of the British or the French. The tragedy of the embargo was how it created for Americans the pernicious influence of their very own government. To enforce this thing, you could not help but to trample upon liberty. A nation that was against British army officers and soldiers being stationed among them in the 1760s and 1770s, now saw its own government officers, including ones in uniform with guns, at gunpoint, enforcing an embargo that many people found absolutely contradictory with some of their basic and most essential rights and liberties. The first act of Madison's presidency, all right, was to repeal the embargo. The second act of Madison's presidency, it's not really the second, but I'm just saying that for rhetorical effect, was to cave in to the Hawks and declare the War of 1812, to declare war upon Great Britain, since Great Britain had been the most egregious in harassing our ships on the high seas. So sadly, the embargo perhaps was the only alternative to a war, all right? And the War of 1812, just like the American Revolution, posed great risks for the future and the prosperity and the liberty of America. When you think about all the challenges that this generation of men faced, when you think about the ways that they responded to all of these challenges, I mean, there are a couple of ways that you could feel. I mean, on the one hand, these men certainly aren't perfect, right? Can you look at the founding generation and find fault? Well, yeah, of course you can. Can you look at these people and find instances when they betrayed their principles, the things that they said they held most dear? Well, of course, certainly you can. But can you look at these people and see that they were, just like us as people, forced with principles that oftentimes came into conflict, forced with tough choices, or faced with tough choices, forced to live in a world that was not of their creation, that was not of their choosing, forced to do the best with what they had? I think, in many respects, that it's amazing what they accomplished. That it's amazing that the nation that they created was even able to survive. I think it's pretty amazing that when you look at this generation of men, when you really think about what mattered most to them, it wasn't about getting power from themselves, right? It was about securing liberty for everyone, unevenly, imperfectly, but eventually. Right? Thomas Jefferson lived to be a very old man. Like Washington before him, he voluntarily stepped down from office after 2 terms. He went back to his home. He lived out the rest of his life. He renewed his friendship with John Adams, who the political strife of the 1790s had caused him to come into conflict. He was friends and neighbors with James Madison, his presidential successor. He did a whole bunch of different things and lived a really long and full life. And at the end, he had only one wish. Jefferson, 83 years old, spring of 1826, it's clear to all around him that he's failing fast. If you look at his symptoms, most doctors now speculate that he had prostate cancer. And there's Jefferson on his deathbed at Monticello. And it's June, then July, 1826. Jefferson has one last wish that he keeps expressing to all the people around him. He wants to live to see the 4th of July. He wants to live to see the 50th anniversary of American independence. And Jefferson is fading in and out of consciousness. At his bedside is his grandson and his grandson-in-law. He wakes up on the night of the 3rd. He's clearly on his last leg. He looks at them and he says, "Is it the 4th?" And they cannot tell a lie. And they say, no, not yet. And then around 11 p.m., he wakes up again and he says, desperately, is it the fourth? And he could go at any moment. And they just couldn't bear to disappoint him. And Nicholas Trist, his grandson-in-law, turned to him and said, yes, yes it is. All right? Is it the fourth? Those words are oftentimes attributed to Jefferson as his last words. But in fact, they're not. His last words were uttered to his doctor, who immediately thereafter tried to give Jefferson another dose of medication. And Jefferson, having been assured that he had lived to see the 4th of July, said his true final words, which were these: "No, doctor, nothing more." Now, this would be a really, cruel story if Jefferson died at 11 p.m. on July 3rd, but of course it's not. He lingered. He lived throughout the night. At one point in the night, this frail man on his deathbed sat up and said, "Call out the Committee of Safety." I mean, he's dreaming in his very last moments about being governor of Virginia during the American Revolution. And around noon on July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson died. Meanwhile, up in Massachusetts, there's another founder, John Adams, who's even a little bit older, who's on his deathbed as well. John Adams, on July 4th, 1826, the same exact day as Thomas Jefferson, would die at 5 p.m. His last words: Thomas Jefferson survives. Which is kind of funny, because Adams was kind of wrong. Poor John Adams, right? But kind of inspiring, right? And this is where I want to wrap up, because John Adams was also, at least metaphorically, right. Thomas Jefferson does survive. Thomas Jefferson survives in all of us. Thomas Jefferson was a man who lived surrounded by complications, a man who lived surrounded by contradictions. He was a man who had to make tough choices, and sometimes his choices were between principles that mattered a great deal to him. But one thing that I think when we look at Thomas Jefferson should matter a great deal to us is that Thomas Jefferson and many of the people of his generation, although they had to choose between principles, at least they were people who cared about principles. Thank you very much.